So I've been really excited for this next one. It's our panel discussion. I'll let all the panelists introduce themselves, but today they're going to talk about a community perspective on open source tracing.
I'm really happy to introduce everyone that's joining us today. Jose Carlos Chávez from Expedia, who works on Zipkin. Sheng, who is with Tetrate and works on SkyWalking. And also Yuri with Uber, who works on Jaeger. And if each of you could give me a little background on yourself, what you do for work and other open source projects that you work on. I know many of you have day jobs besides the work that you do for the community. So it would be great to hear about that as well. Jose Carlos, maybe you could start us off today.
Yeah, sure. Hi, thank you, Jonah. Yeah, I work for Expedia, and I always been working in userland, and even before Expedia. On Expedia, I've been working on a platform and that is providing a game changer experience when it comes to trips, flight incidents, flight delays, cancellations. But since I joined, one of my requests was to stay on the user side, to not to lose the perspective, which I believe is very important. When it comes to contributing to observability projects, I have been working on distributed systems for around 6 years, but started contributing to Zipkin 3 years now. My collaboration does not only focus on Zipkin, but I also contribute to other observability projects. Definitely, it's not easy to balance the work and the open source time, but when you get passionate about something, then you just forget about the time. You just keep going, and then you realize that you spend the whole weekend.
Yeah, as long as you're not burning yourself out with that. I mean, it's a challenge when you're really excited about something and then you have to balance all your obligations. So everyone thanks you for your community contributions, for sure. Yuri, how about yourself? Could you give us a similar kind of background? Thanks.
Sure, thanks. I spent many years working in the finance industry, building trading systems for complex trading financial products. And then 5 years ago, I joined Uber, where I started working on core infrastructure and specifically in the observability space. This is where we started the Jaeger project. It started as an internal project and then grew up to be open source, which is the distributed tracing platform that Uber uses widely. And I was lucky because this was kind of my primary job. So the development of Jaeger coincided with the open source activities, although there was still a lot of kind of late night work, just building a community and responding to things that are not necessarily as interesting to Uber or even necessary. Like we support a lot of different storage backends, which we are not ourselves using. And so the definitely open source takes some other cycles from you if you want to maintain a successful project.
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot of work, especially when you're part of a software consortium or standards group. And I know that adds a lot of burden on top of your additional work and contributing to the community. And Sheng has a similar situation with his project. Maybe Sheng, you could tell us a little bit about your background and your current day-to-day work and the open source work you do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, currently the last 2 years I joined the Tetrate as a founding engine. So we are building the service mesh based on Istio and Envoy. Also provide observability based on the Apache SkyWalking. So for me, maybe luckily, I can do both open source and the daily job on the same time, like 50-50. So I can spend most of the day on the open source community, but the major purpose of that, we need to focus on the service mesh observability, and the community is major focus on the agent-based APM system. So there is a little gap there, but still I have the lucky thing. Before that, like 5 years ago, I created the project SkyWalking, and I bring the project into the Apache Foundation. Now it's the top level project. We have to contribute to all of the world. So this is lucky thing. So we can have an open source project. Now we can use that open source project in my daily job.
It's great to hear, and I know we've seen a lot of evolution in community standards, and both SkyWalking and Jaeger are part of these software consortiums, and so we've seen, sort of looking back a few years, the creation of open tracing, Google bringing open census in, and now we're moving towards this open telemetry standard where we're trying to kind of take the best of both approaches and have a lot of common instrumentation and APIs. And I know that there's been obviously change throughout the development of these standards, and it continues to occur. I know some of the challenges are, around these changes have been apparent to all of you in your projects. Maybe we could hear a little bit about what you think of the current trajectory and, maybe some of the challenges, the positives, the negatives. That would be great. I'll probably kind of just go in the same circle. So maybe Jose Carlos, if you could pick us off on that one. And then it would be great to hear from everyone on it.
Right. I think open tracing was a great initiative I was part of. That was actually my first point of contact to distributed tracing and observability. I think the idea could land into very interesting learnings and technology, like, for example, truly interop initiatives like data format or propagation, but unfortunately it was canceled. Still, I think it left lots of lesson learned in terms of what to do, what shouldn't be done anymore. Census was actually a really cool project. It was an opinionated approach that I liked, but sadly it was also canceled or absorbed, depending how you see it. Like, before it could actually nail high user problems. I think some people still use it, but like, if you go to the repositories, the project is not anymore a thing. Still, I think those two initiatives were really good, and in the end, they ended up being open telemetry. My perception is that open telemetry is trying to like restart the grounds around observability. It's trying to doing lots of new abstractions. Sometimes it could feel like ambitious, reinventing so many wheels at the same time. I still would like to see how it ends, like how it gets some traction, and know what happens. I think it's not trying to build bridges or unifying paths. It's more like resetting the whole thing. So it's going to be interesting. Still, there are other alternatives around, right? It's not like open telemetry or nothing. So it will be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, and there's also been a lot of work in open telemetry on standardizing things that haven't been standardized well before, that we've all been dealing with the pain from, whether it's metrics or logs. And a lot of those discussions are still somewhat early in terms of the taxonomies there, but having some standard way of describing logs would help a lot of people with writing things that are more easily consumed. So it is very ambitious and very broad. Yuri, what's your take on kind of the past history and where we are with open telemetry?
So I'm on the governance board of Open Telemetry project, and to me, one of the biggest challenges that Open Telemetry was trying to solve was the fact that we did have these two competing fairly popular projects, Open Tracing and Open Census, which were trying to do kind of very similar thing and leaving the industry in indecision state where you don't know which one to pick, you don't know which one will win. And they took slightly different approaches to how they were trying to solve the problem. And as we said, OpenTelemetry took the kind of the best parts of both of those approaches, so that you have both a very abstract API that is vendor neutral, so that you can implement it any way you want. That's the part from the Open Tracing, but at the same time it comes with a very standard SDK, so that you don't have to implement it. And not only you, but also any vendor, they don't really have to go and re-implement the thing, which was the problem with Open Tracing. And because of the standard SDK, OpenTelemetry also provides the standard data format, standard propagation format. So eventually, the hope is that it can take the instrumentation question to be not a question anymore. So the software that everyone writes can just come with standard telemetry coming out, and people can focus, people like me, we can focus on developing like tracing backends or analytics tools rather than worrying about how to instrument any particular framework. So I think that's to me is a very promising thing, and it was also kind of the promise of Open Tracing originally. It just didn't quite materialize, and as we said, we've learned a lot of things from that project.
Yeah, and I mean, it's always the argument of the difference between automating instrumentation with agents or building it into libraries, and there are definitely pretty big differences between these implementations and agents. And I know Sheng, we've talked before about SkyWalking's approach and that it collects different types of data. Maybe you could tell us your perspective on these standards drives that have been occurring, and maybe some of the things that you're doing that's a bit different with SkyWalking and the agents. That would be interesting.
So yes, at the SkyWalking point, we're covering a lot of languages, and especially for the Java, .NET, PHP, Node.js, such language like this, we can have a two-instrument agent. And all of our users love that point because they didn't want to change the code. No matter from the Open Tracing, Open Census, Open Telemetry perspective, there is some instruments happens in their codes. Maybe in the library, but eventually that will happen in their codes. But people are expected they do nothing. So I think there's a trade-off of this kind of project, because we know there is a lot of commercial vendors in the APM field, AppDynamic, Tetrate, Yuri, Logz.io. All of these have a two-instrument agent because people want that. So, but from my take, nearly 3 or 4 years ago, I also spent a lot of time on the Open Tracing too. Because from my perspective, this project like this maybe not provide a consistent API eventually cover all of the case, but they provide a very good case to educate people. Nearly today, when people read different tracing projects, the Open Tracing concepts are covering these cases. They will help people to understand all of this one. Also, even different projects provide a different API eventually, because they are the implementation, they take the call, so you cannot change. Even you have some kind of specification and the implementation could say, no, we don't have that. Please use this one because this is our implementation. Even in this case, they provide a very similar concept. So people when switch from one project to another, or they want to learn something new, still, these things are very friendly. So that is my perspective about this kind of project. It helps people at different cases. So, but for the Open Telemetry, there may be too big, this project, especially when you covered about the metrics. Because there is metrics about some platform metrics or framework metrics that may be easier to be designed. But in the real world, in the APM vendor or in some business performance management, the actually case is about people want to manage performance about their business case. So about something like the trend of the orders, how many money already be trained. That is another thing. That is not the same as normally metrics and normally tracing. So they still need to have their API to cover different cases, even you provide, let's say, easy API from the OpenTelemetry side.
Yeah. So do you anticipate that you're going to adapt SkyWalking agents to be able to export data using OpenTelemetry standards, or do you sort of want your agents to work with SkyWalking and you're going to kind of see what happens with the community? I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, currently we are only watching, because our agent is very stable and super powerful. So if we are going to adopt anything else, we need to make sure those things are very protection ready, such as for the open tracing Java implementation. We are still keeps in 0.13 because that version is kept stable and the people use that. We didn't upgrade and we keep not upgrade today. So that's the case. We need to answer to the whole community, because like SkyWalking's Twitter said, we have people monitoring thousands, even tens of thousands instances, and provide like millions of tracing per second. So we need to wait. We need to wait. Everything keeps in the stable.
Yeah, and similarly, I mean, Jose Carlos, with Zipkin, there's obviously a huge install base because it's been around for so long. So what's your take on the agents that are part of Zipkin and whether those are going to adopt or adapt to some of these new standards? I mean, it seems like it's pretty active with the Zipkin agents. Where do you think things are going to go there?
Yeah, so basically we don't have any agent. We go for the library instrumentation for now, mostly because Zipkin is a volunteering project. So if we will have an agent, we will need some cycles from people to write it. Because mostly what you write for agent, the code you write for agents is not reusable in libraries. So it requires a massive effort. In the other hand, building libraries for us, and we truly believe that provides learning for users, which is also something very important for us. When you instrument your app, although it's quite time-consuming, you get to know what you are doing, right? Or at least that is what we think. And on top of that, we already spent all our, let's say, effort writing the libraries. They are quite stable. They are quite developed, flexible for use cases. So starting an agent at this point, it will be quite time-consuming.
Got it. I mean, from someone that comes more from the enterprise in terms of my background, most of the time people do want an agent because they either didn't write the code, they don't know the code, there's legacy code, it could be third-party code too that's involved there. So, you know, I can see the need for agents and auto instrumentation, but also to your point, if the developer really knows the business of the application and writes good instrumentation, then, you know, then that's great. Yuri, what's your take on agents and instrumentation?
So interestingly, Jaeger historically stayed away from the instrumentation side altogether. We did provide client libraries, but they were just implementation of the open tracing interface. And so how you wrote instrumentation was kind of your business. If there was an agent, and there was an agent in open tracing, like called special agent for Java, I don't know how, it probably wasn't very popular because it happened close to the end of the development. But from the Jaeger as a project, that didn't really matter, because as soon as you are able to export the data, we would take over from that point, right? So personally, I feel that the agent approach is definitely very powerful, especially as a way to get people in very quickly, because unless you're in a very special language like Go or C, where you can't really do agent, which ironically happened to be where Uber is, so we couldn't even go with that approach. But with the more JVM or VM-based languages, it's much easier to do agents, and so it opens up a path for people to quickly get up and running with distributed tracing or with any telemetry, really. I think that's a very powerful approach. And so OpenTelemetry actually is developing agents as well. Datadog actually donated them because they started already developed very powerful agents as well, and OpenTelemetry is kind of converting them to be compliant with the OpenTelemetry API, to be vendor neutral in that way, so that again, if you are just starting up, you can bring the agent and you get all the instrumentation flowing. But at the same time, because you still have OpenTelemetry interface inside, if you want to go deeper and say instrument the way you would normally do something like add a span around the function or emit a new metric that is not part of the agent, then you have that same standard API in your hands. And so it kind of opens up a path for power developers to go deeper than just a standard instrumentation. So yeah, I'm hopeful that this will again materialize. I think open tracing at the time was just getting into the agent space, but it didn't have a chance to do that. We at Uber, we used so almost like an agent style instrumentation in Python. So it was part of the open tracing as well, a library which would instrument very common framework automatically.
Yeah, and obviously at Open Census and what they built at Google, there was a lot of pretty interesting agents for doing diagnostics and other things beyond just collecting what I'll call tracing data that were developed there that are part of the project too. I did want to kind of move on a little bit and sort of talk a little bit about what observability means to each of you. I know that everyone kind of has their own perspective on monitoring and diagnostics, and just kind of wanted to hear what everyone thought about it, just to sort of give people an idea of where your head is at, so that when we start talking about what's coming next in the future, they'll understand where you're kind of coming from, because everyone has a different background. So maybe I'm going to switch things up, and Sheng, can you start out and tell us a little bit about what you believe in and where you think things are going around observability and monitoring?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Because today, even all of the observability keeps in different levels. So there is infrastructure level or application level, network level. Seems different, especially today we are talking about the tracing. Actually, the tracing, we are standing here from Jaeger, SkyWalking, Zipkin. Actually, we are doing very similar, at the same time, very different things. Let's say for the Zipkin and Jaeger tracing, they are cover different fields. You can trace in the things in the storage implementation, in the operation system level, or at cloud infrastructure. That's for them. But for the SkyWalking, we are doing same, named it observability, but for the tracing, we are tracing the business logic. So when an application gets accessed and they do distributed deployment, then we show you how the topology look like, how the metrics look like, and what's the relationship between the service and the instance, even the port performance. Also, like we posted a blog recently on the newsstand, we are talking about the profiling. That's a very specific application performance fusion. Zipkin and Jaeger have no interest with that because they are not. This is not their field. The profiling is about we are going to use the thread dump to see the performance of each method. Every method can be measured, but in the tracing case, this is not accountable, or this is not affordable in the real world. But if you are using the case in the application performance, we can do such assumption about most of the codes execute in one thread, and they are executed sequentially, and we can do this thread dump to measure the performance. So this is very interesting case. Also for the metrics, like I said, there is a metrics about the business. not just about the TPS, the successful rates. We have more. So that's a major difference. So from my side, observability, people need to get rid of the word only. They should understand what the thing they want to observe. Do you want to observe the infrastructure, or do you want to observe your business, even the service quality or the service performance?
Yeah, so there's two pieces. You're kind of thinking about the high level piece and the low level piece in terms of how you do diagnostics. But getting back to some of Yuri's points, I mean, that's easier to do in something like Java where it's JVM based. When you start getting to compiled languages, it becomes really hard to do that type of profiling and debugging. And going back to what I said about Open Census, I think they built a lot of interesting debuggers and profilers as part of their agents that are, I don't think are being well adopted by the community, that are some pretty cool intellectual property as far as I'm concerned. Yuri, did you want to comment on that piece? Where do you think things are going? What observability means to you?
Yeah, the observability, you can talk forever about what it means, and there are very many aspects. I agree with Sheng that at minimum there are like these two pieces, sort of application performance measurements or performance signals, and kind of business signals. You can also, in business signals, you can think of user analytics, right? So it's like Google Analytics is a tool. Ultimately, it's still an observability tool, but it's sort of not being considered that much today in most of the observability like APM vendor tools. They don't often have that aspect, which I think from the technology that's backing the data collection, it's almost the same technology. You still need the ability to do the collect events, to be able to slice and dice them, and this is ultimately what all the APM tools provide. There's also, you can extend this into other areas. Performance for the application metrics you can view that as a business observability as well, because ultimately the goal of application performance monitoring is happy users, and so you like latency is important not because it's important just for the service, it's important as a user experience, right? And so you can look at it as pure business metrics, as for example at Uber, how many trips people are taking, but then if your business metric starts like behaving not the way you want it, that's the point that you start diving into application performance metrics and saying, well, why they're not taking people? Because your latency went up and they go to another app, right? And so those are very tightly related to me. There's also other aspects where you can think of where, and I think that's where the performance profiling comes in play, is when we start thinking about developer experience. Because as you develop these complex distributed systems, you need to understand, and it's very hard sometimes to understand even what's going on. Like a typical request at Uber hits about like 50 microservices, and so when something goes wrong in that, it's not straightforward at all to figure out, and you are probably working on just one piece of it. But if your piece is somewhere close to the top, and it throws an error, then you're ultimately responsible to fixing it, even though the error may be coming from like all the downstream dependencies that you have. And so without observability, you don't even have any means of figuring out, well, what's next, what to do, right? And so that's why distributed tracing is kind of becoming popular these days, because as people start developing more cloud technologies and distributed systems, that question comes more and more often. And sure, if you at some point isolated the problem to one component, then you probably can use other tools as well. You can go Linux profiling, performance profiling, and figure out what specifically is wrong about this particular instance. But to get there out of the whole cloud, you need some higher level tools, which is what tracing provides you. So yeah, I think there's many ways of thinking about observability.
Yeah, thanks. Very good point. But also, it was interesting that you brought up end user monitoring, real user monitoring, not really something that we've talked a lot about, and not something that I've seen really incorporated into the open source space. I mean, if you look at where that came from, Boomerang and the JavaScript instrumentation that was written at Yahoo a long time ago is still the foundation for a lot of that stuff, and it's not really been part of the tracing systems yet. So it'll be interesting to see if that evolves and sort of becomes incorporated in a bit more. I think that that's an interesting point. And then getting back to the business metrics, sometimes you can see a business metric changing because of something that's happening in the environment. Like if you're having a spike in your business or a marketing promotion, I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell whether it's a result of a technical problem or actually a business change. I mean, these are kind of some of the challenges that you have to deal with. But very good points. Jose Carlos, can you tell us what you think about observability and maybe where you see things going from your perspective?
Yeah. So I think people was too eager to give a formal definition of what observability is, like using control theory or whatever. But observability as we know it now, the field as we know it is quite young and probably arose when distributed system started becoming popular. So I don't think we need a very formal definition involving mathematical duals and all that, because we don't know yet where is this going, right? The definition I usually like is like that it's a property of a system that allows you to understand internal states from inputs and output signals, right? In a way that from that understanding you can distill actions. That said, I think observability is moving towards more and better data collection, as Yuri said, like more granular collection of data, but also moving into a proactive like model, because right now we have been all the time reacting, right? Like if there is a latency or if there is a deviation in your metrics, then you go and look what is happening. Or if users are complaining over Twitter that the checkout page doesn't work, then you go and check the distributed traces and see, okay, this is failing here. But the truth is that given that we have more and more services, more and more complex infrastructure, we need to move into a more proactive model where metrics or actually data talk to you and not you asking questions to data, right? In that sense, I see some good efforts from, for example, Haystack, which is doing adaptive alerting, trends based on span data, and all sort of processing after the collection that identify anomalies and then notify the users, right? Because we cannot afford anymore that where your team created a dashboard and then say like, okay, let's look at the dashboard the whole day looking for something going wrong. So yeah, I think the way it's moving now, it's in more granular data collection, better data collection, but also proactive alerting.
Yeah, so I mean, you're talking about the application of more types of machine learning or anomaly detection, which is definitely something that's been missing in the open source space. So I think that's it's definitely an area where there needs to be more investment, and it can definitely help. But you still need both sides, right? You need to be able to do the diagnostics and the deep dive part of the analysis of a problem, but being notified early is definitely a key. One kind of final question that's like sort of, I'll say more about your career personally for each of you. What inspired you to kind of get involved in this type of work? Meaning, what interested you in tracing and diagnosing things? I mean, for me, I love taking things apart and really understanding everything down to the deepest components. So I always find this and security work pretty fascinating personally, just because you have to really understand everything in a system to be able to understand how it's going to behave or how it is behaving. But I just wanted a little understanding of each of you, how you got involved in this kind of work, and what really inspires you to be part of the tracing community. So maybe Wu Sheng, can you start us out with that?
Sure, gladly. I personally joined all of these tracing monitoring since nearly 8 years ago, 2012. The reason I did that because I live in a disaster project. In that project is one of the top China telecom company. So we have 8 vendors to doing a SOA-based distributed system back to 8 years ago. So you can imagine that there is always fights among these vendors. And I'm still thinking, because I lead one of the teams, so I was thinking about I need a tool to measure who take the responsibility, who we could blame, rather than we fight each other every time. But that is thing started. Also, that is the thing why from the beginning, we thought the agent is super important, because there are 7 vendors there. They are not going to accept anything you want. So the only way you can measure them is to provide agent instrumentation. Luckily, we are mostly used in Java and C#. So we have luck to build the agent instrumentation. So with that, after that, we open source whole project, and all of the community push us in the position we are.
Cool, interesting. Yuri, how about you? What got you into this whole area of expertise, so to speak?
More of an accident, I would say. When I was working on finance, I was primarily on the product side of things, so kind of developing the end product. And I wanted to move more into the infrastructure space because I found it more challenging and interesting technically. And so that's why I went to Uber, and observability was kind of one of the only options available in that thing. And so when I started diving in, I found that there's a lot of things that I like about that space, and that interests me to work on. I also think that like there's always discussions, is software engineering like an art or a trade, or not engineering part, but specifically like the code development part, right? And I tend to view it more of an art in some way, because when you're writing some piece of code and it just doesn't feel right? So that's not something that maybe it also in the trade the same thing, but if it doesn't feel right, you try to make it more beautiful, more elegant, right? And so performance is kind of one of those things that I feel that most engineers get satisfaction when you just make that same program run twice as fast, right? With like a little things. And so to me, that has always been very satisfying thing to achieve. And suddenly now I'm working on a tool which allows that to other developers to basically achieve that same thing. So it's just kind of the satisfaction squared from that, like maybe indirect at the same time, but you empower other people to do that thing that's very interesting to me personally. So yeah, I'm very interested in that space because of that.
Cool, nice. And Jose Carlos, how about yourself?
Yeah, I think it was purely curiosity. Like when I joined my former company, we started moving towards microservices, and then we found all of different kind of problems in terms of latency, errors, and then by that time, someone presented about open tracing. Our primary stack was PHP, so I said like, okay, let's have a look. And we realized that there was no open tracing for PHP, so I started writing one myself. Then I got involved into Zipkin. The community was very engaging. Then when I started using the actual instrumentation in our code, and you could see the spans and how services were communicating to each other, I think I kind of got obsessed on seeing what was happening inside the request. So I started writing more and more instrumentation to to instrument services and get to know what is happening, how we could improve latency and how could debug errors better. Then you see how rewarding it is when developers come to you and then you explain the concept, and then they are able to actually pinpoint the problems or improve latency. So I think it was purely curiosity to get to know what happens in a request, which is a kind of basic thing you start with in observability, but that drove me through the whole path, like getting to know more and more about tracing and observability, and getting more interest on the stuff. And ultimately, like, I guess understanding problems, solving problems, and help users, that's what drives me in this field.
Yeah, so pretty common thread across everyone, that really empowering other people with information to solve these problems and improve the quality of their work seems to be coming out, and allowing people to collaborate more effectively definitely makes a lot of sense. So
yeah,
great to hear it. Yeah.
Also, sorry, something that is truly, like, I would say, exciting is that your code, like software you develop yourself at home or somewhere else, ends up running in production system for other people. That's also very like exciting and rewarding, I would say. So yeah, that's another motivation, of course.
Yeah, cool. Well, with that, I believe we're running out of time here, so I wanted to wrap up by thanking Sheng, Yuri, and Jose Carlos for joining us on the panel. Very interesting. I hope that we can do more of these and have other discussions so that people can hear from you and hear about the great work that you're doing within your respective projects. And best of luck to all of you on your open source adventures and your companies and the work that you're doing. And thanks for contributing to the community. And with that, I think we will move on to the next session. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.